Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something, a question that's been on a lot of people's minds, I think.
Oh, yeah.
How feminism has impacted men. We're going to be looking at it through this book,
Okay.
Soccer Moms Gone Wild, How Feminism Hijacked America by Conrad Riker.
Riker. He doesn't pull any punches, does he? Gets right into some sensitive topics.
Yeah, he does.
The education system, family courts.
You know, that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, I think. One of the first things that really hit me reading the book was Riker's claim about boys falling behind
Yeah, he talks about that.
in education.
Yeah.
And he cites some pretty startling statistics, like the fact that boys are behind girls in reading and writing in every single U.S. state. That's every state,
Wow.
across the board.
Yeah, I think that's from the National Center for Education Statistics.
Yeah, he pulls that from their data.
And what's interesting is how he connects that to the way that we teach boys and how we discipline them. You know, he argues that traditional classrooms just might not be the best fit for how boys learn. And he suggests that some of the current discipline policies, like the zero tolerance,
Right.
might be unfairly impacting boys
Because?
because they tend to be, more physically active. There's that stereotype, right? Boys are going to be boys. And maybe they're just more likely to get in trouble for that.
That does make you think, right? Like, our attempts to create a more equal learning environment, are we actually disadvantaging boys?
Yeah. I mean, he even goes so far as to suggest that maybe single-sex schools could be part of the solution. What do you think about that?
Wow. I don't know. It's a really interesting idea. And it plays into, I think, Riker's bigger argument that these societal shifts, a lot of them driven by feminist ideology, have left men in a very precarious position. Which leads us to his next point.
Okay.
A real hot button issue. Bias in the family courts.
Yeah.
He claims that men are at a serious disadvantage, especially when it comes to custody battles. And he throws out this statistic that made me, really stop and think.
Okay.
Women are awarded sole custody in over 80% of cases.
80%.
Over 80%. I mean, that's a huge number.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what's going on there.
Right. And Riker, he really criticizes this best interest of the child standard.
Oh, yeah.
He suggests that it's often interpreted in a way that favors the mother. And he also brings up the financial burdens that are placed on fathers, child support payments, and how these can be really challenging, especially if you look at more and more women becoming the primary breadwinners these days.
Right.
So it's interesting how he frames that. It's like, on the surface, it looks like, promoting gender equality.
Right.
But is it actually reinforcing these traditional gender roles in a way that hurts men?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a complex issue. And I think Riker raises some valid points. I mean, it's not about denying the progress that's been made for women, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there might be these unintended consequences that we need to look at.
Absolutely. And, speaking of societal expectations, let's talk about the media.
Okay.
Riker's pretty critical of the way men are portrayed, especially fathers. He argues that men are often shown as these incompetent, bumbling fools.
Yeah. Or even absent altogether.
Yeah. Like the classic sitcom dad.
Yeah, the clueless dad.
Right. Constantly being outsmarted by his wife and kids.
Right.
So it's like there's this underlying message, right, that men are just not cut out for fatherhood.
Yeah.
And Riker, he argues that this negative portrayal, it really reinforces these societal expectations that devalue the role of men in the family.
Yeah. I mean, it makes you think about how these media representations, they might actually be influencing us without us even realizing it. Are we internalizing these negative stereotypes?
Right.
And are we underestimating the contributions of fathers? I think it's something to really think about.
It is. It is. And this kind of leads into another area where Riker argues that men are facing some serious challenges, health and well-being. He presents some pretty alarming statistics, like the fact that men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than women.
Oh, wow. That's a tough one.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And he suggests that these societal expectations, men need to be stoic, they need to be strong and silent. It might actually be preventing them from getting help.
Yeah, just suck it up, deal with it.
Right.
Which can be really damaging.
Yeah. And then there's this idea that he brings up, the concept of male disposability.
Oh, yeah.
This idea that society views men as expendable, especially in dangerous jobs. And he backs this up with some scary statistics from OSHA showing that men account for the vast majority, like a huge majority, of workplace deaths. It makes you think about all those pressures on men, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be providers,
Mm-hmm.
to be protectors,
Mm-hmm.
to be strong and silent. It's a lot to carry.
It is. It makes you wonder, are we doing enough to actually support men, their mental and emotional well-being? Are we acknowledging the unique challenges they face?
Right, and Riker seems to think we're not. And then he takes it a step further and really challenges this whole notion of male privilege.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
He argues that while it might exist for some men, the statistics on things like homelessness, life expectancy, violent crime, they paint a very different picture.
It's a different side of the story that you don't often hear.
No, you don't.
He's suggesting that maybe, just maybe, men face their own set of disadvantages that we often overlook.
Right, exactly. And he doesn't shy away from taking on this whole toxic masculinity narrative either.
Oh, yeah.
He sees it as this harmful generalization. Saying it just demonizes any expression of traditional masculinity and ignores all the positive aspects.
It's interesting. It makes you think, are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater here? Are we focusing so much on the negative that we're forgetting all the good things that men bring to the table, the strengths?
That's something I've been really kind of wrestling with myself, trying to find that balance, acknowledging the problems without demonizing an entire gender.
Right. It's tricky.
It is tricky. It is. And I think that's what Riker's trying to do here. He's really asking us to rethink our assumptions and just look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, and he does that by looking at some interesting things. Like he brings up the selective service.
Oh, right.
And he points out that, only men are required to register.
Right.
And he sees that as a pretty clear indication of the societal expectation that, men are the protectors.
Interesting.
And then he even mentions that during World War II, both men and women were subject to the draft.
Yeah.
So there's been a shift, obviously.
It makes you wonder what's changed. Why are we still holding on to this idea that men are the ones who have to sacrifice?
Yeah, it's a good question. And Riker, he doesn't stop there. He tackles other areas where he sees men facing these potential disadvantages. Like he looks at the legal system. He argues that some laws, especially those surrounding domestic violence, might actually be skewed against men.
Oh, interesting.
And he suggests that male victims of domestic violence, they often face a lot of skepticism. They don't get the support that they need.
Wow.
And he even explores the possibility of bias in criminal sentencing. He cites studies that indicate that men get harsher punishments than women for similar crimes.
It's like he's building this case that there's a systemic bias against men.
Yeah.
Within the legal system.
He's definitely going against the grain here.
He is.
And it's worth thinking about whether there's any truth to what he's saying.
Yeah, I think it's important to have these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they challenge our beliefs. And Riker, he definitely doesn't hold back. He goes on to criticize what he calls feminist overreach in policy and legislation. What does he mean by that?
Well, he gives these examples like affirmative consent laws and workplace harassment policies.
Yeah. He argues that, while they might have good intentions, they've been used against men in some cases.
So it's like he's saying the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction.
Right.
That in our attempt to create gender equality, we might have accidentally stepped on the rights of men.
Yeah, it's a controversial point for sure. But he's essentially arguing that the conversation needs to be more balanced.
Right, more nuanced.
And that's where he brings in this rise of men's rights movements. He talks about figures like Jordan Peterson and James Damore.
Okay, yeah.
Who've been very critical of feminist ideology and faced a lot of backlash for it.
They have.
And what's interesting is how Riker frames this. He sees it as part of this larger trend of silencing dissenting voices, particularly men who dare to challenge the feminist narrative.
So it's like you can't even speak out against it without being shut down.
Right, exactly. And his point is that we need to be open to hearing different perspectives, even if we don't agree with them. He argues that a healthy dialogue about gender requires input from both men and women.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. But just to go back to education for a second, Riker, he argues that there could be some unintended consequences to policies that are meant to promote gender equality.
Okay. Like what?
Well, for example, he suggests that the curriculum, even though it seems neutral on the surface, could actually be geared towards girls' learning styles. He mentions that boys might do better in a more hands-on environment, kinesthetic.
Right, learning by doing.
Yeah. And that's not always available in traditional classrooms. And then he brings up the whole issue of discipline again. pointing out that boys, because they tend to be more physically active, they might be disproportionately affected by these zero-tolerance policies.
So we're setting them up to fail, almost.
That's what he seems to be saying.
Mm.
And he's not just talking about academics either. He talks about the social and emotional aspects of schooling, saying that boys might be missing out on opportunities to really develop healthy masculinity.
In what way?
Well, he points to the decline of recess, and competitive sports. And he suggests that boys are being deprived of these outlets for physical activity and social interaction. And he even brings up the issue of male role models in schools.
Oh, interesting.
He argues that what he calls the feminization of the teaching profession has left boys without enough positive male figures to look up to.
It's a really complex issue.
It is.
And there's no easy answer.
No, but his book, it definitely makes us question whether our current approach to education is really serving the needs of boys.
Right.
He's essentially saying that we need to be more mindful. We need to think about the unintended consequences of our policies and make sure that we're not creating a system that actually disadvantages one gender over another.
Yeah, finding that balance
Right.
between promoting equality and making sure that the needs of all students are being met.
Exactly. But we've only scratched the surface here.
Oh, I bet.
There's so much more to explore in the chapters ahead.
Can't wait. From there, Riker takes us into, I guess you could say, a pretty challenging area. He starts arguing that there's this growing normalization of misandry in society.
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the book.
Yeah.
He's basically saying that hostility towards men is becoming more and more acceptable.
Right.
And it's showing up everywhere, like from casual jokes to how men are portrayed in the media.
And what I found fascinating was how he tied that back to the feminist narrative.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that some feminist ideologies, even though they're advocating for women's rights, they might have unintentionally created this environment where it's okay to kind of demonize men.
Right, and he uses some pretty strong examples.
Yeah.
Like he brings up that hashtag #KillAnn.
Oh, yeah.
You see that on social media, and he makes his point that a lot of people dismiss it as just hyperbole.
Right.
But he's saying it reflects this deeper undercurrent of hostility.
Yeah, and I think his point is that kind of normalization, it can have real world consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
It can affect things like family court decisions,
Mhm.
hiring practices, even how we perceive male victims of violence.
It's a scary thought. Like, has it really become socially acceptable to express hatred towards an entire gender?
It's a tough question.
It is.
And it's one that I think we need to be talking about. Are we becoming more tolerant of misandry? And if so, what does that mean?
Right. What are the implications? Okay, so moving on. Riker also spends a lot of time on a topic that's especially relevant for, men who are fathers or who are thinking about becoming fathers.
Okay.
This idea of the erasure of men from family life. He argues that a lot of our legal and social welfare policies, they operate under this assumption that mothers are the primary caregivers.
Right.
Which can leave fathers feeling pretty marginalized, like their role isn't valued.
Yeah, and he brings up those statistics we talked about earlier about child custody arrangements, how mothers are overwhelmingly getting sole custody.
Right, over 80% of the time.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he talks about the financial burdens on fathers, child support payments.
Right.
And how that can be incredibly difficult, especially, for men who are already struggling financially.
It's a huge burden for a lot of guys.
And he doesn't just focus on the money either. He also talks about the emotional toll of father absence.
Right.
How kids who grow up without involved dads are more likely to face certain challenges.
Yeah, like
Academic difficulties, behavioral problems, even things like substance abuse.
Yeah, that's tough.
And it raises these really important questions about the role of fathers in society today.
Yeah.
Are we doing enough to support fathers? Are we encouraging them to be actively involved in their kids' lives?
And Riker's point seems to be that, no, we're not.
No, he doesn't think so. He sees this systemic bias against fathers within the legal system, within social welfare programs.
So what does he propose we do about it?
Well, he's really urging us to take a hard look at these policies.
Yeah.
To make sure that fathers are being treated fairly, that they have equal opportunities to be involved parents. It's like a call to action for fathers to stand up for their rights, to demand to be recognized as equal partners in parenting.
It's a powerful message.
It is. And then he goes even further. He starts examining the criminal justice system.
Okay.
and argues that men face a real disadvantage there as well.
In what way?
Well, he claims that men are more likely to be arrested, charged with crimes, convicted, and they often receive harsher sentences than women for similar offenses.
Really?
Yeah, he brings up these studies that show there are significant sentencing disparities between men and women.
Even for the same crime?
Even when you take into account things like the severity of the crime,
Yeah.
and criminal history.
Wow. That's pretty shocking.
It is. And then he also talks about the issue of false accusations against men.
Oh,
And
yeah.
how those can be just devastating.
They can ruin lives.
Absolutely. So he's highlighting this need for a justice system that's truly fair, that protects the rights of both the accused and the accuser.
It's about finding that balance.
Right. Making sure that justice is served while also protecting innocent people.
And then Riker shifts gears a little bit. He starts talking about media campaigns against male public figures.
Okay.
And he argues that men are often held to a different standard than women when it comes to allegations of misconduct.
Like a double standard.
Yeah, and he brings up examples like the #MeToo movement.
Right.
Which, while it's been incredibly important in bringing attention to sexual harassment and assault, it's also, in some cases, led to, this rush to judgment and a lack of due process for the accused.
And Riker, he's very careful. He's not trying to downplay how serious sexual misconduct is. But he's raising these concerns about false accusations and the impact they can have on innocent men. So he's advocating for a more balanced approach, one that recognizes that we need to support victims, but also make sure that the rights of the accused are protected.
So it's about fairness and justice for everyone involved.
Exactly. And this kind of brings us back to the core of his argument, I think.
Okay.
The impact of feminist ideology on men. He believes that a lot of the challenges men are facing today are a direct result of what he calls these extreme feminist ideologies that have become mainstream. He points to the concept of toxic masculinity, saying it paints all expressions of traditional masculinity as harmful. So men feel demonized for just being men. And he also criticizes the focus on male privilege, saying it ignores the very real struggles that many men face, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So he sees this disconnect between the feminist narrative, which often portrays men as powerful and privileged, and the reality for a lot of guys who are dealing with things like poverty, homelessness, mental health problems.
So he's saying the feminist movement, even though it's accomplished a lot of great things for women, it might have gone too far in some ways.
Yeah, and created this backlash among men who feel like their voices aren't being heard and their needs aren't being met. And that's where the rise of men's rights movements comes in.
Oh, right.
Riker talks about groups like the National Coalition for Men, A Voice for Men.
Okay.
These groups that are advocating for, greater recognition of the challenges men face.
Yeah.
And they're calling for changes in laws and policies that they see as discriminatory.
And they get a lot of pushback, don't they?
Yeah, they do. They face a lot of criticism, accusations of misogyny.
Right.
But Riker, he sees them as a necessary counterbalance to what he sees as the excesses of the feminist movement. His argument is that we need input from both men and women to have a healthy dialogue about gender, and that silencing the voices of men who are critical of feminism is just going to further divide the genders.
It makes sense. You need to hear both sides of the story.
Right. And it's not just about changing laws and policies. Riker also emphasizes this idea of individual responsibility and personal growth.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he believes that men need to take ownership of their own lives, develop healthy ways of coping with stress and adversity, and cultivate positive relationships with other men. He encourages men to embrace their masculinity, not in a toxic or aggressive way, but in a way that's both strong and compassionate.
So it's about finding that balance again.
Right. He sees a need for men to reclaim their roles as protectors and providers, not just for their families, but for society as a whole. It's this call to action for men to step up, be the best versions of themselves for their own well-being and for the good of the world.
And even though he focuses a lot on the challenges men face, he does acknowledge that gender dynamics are complex. He recognizes that women also have their own unique struggles.
Absolutely.
So he's emphasizing the need for men and women to work together.
Right. To create a more just and equitable society for everyone, to move away from that us versus them mentality that we see so often in these discussions about gender.
Yeah.
And move towards a more collaborative, understanding approach.
Where we can all learn from each other.
Exactly. He's
Yeah.
envisioning this future where men and women can support each other's goals and aspirations, recognizing that true equality benefits everybody.
It's a really hopeful message.
It is. It is. Now, just to circle back to education for a moment,
Okay.
Riker brings up this specific concern that he calls the normalization of misandry in education.
Oh, wow.
So he's arguing that there's this growing trend of demonizing boys and men in schools,
Hmm.
often under the guise of promoting gender equality.
Like, what kind of things is he talking about?
Well, he gives examples like the way history is taught, often focusing on the achievements of women while downplaying the contributions of men.
Mm.
And he also criticizes the use of gender-neutral language, suggesting that it kind of erases the unique experiences and perspectives of boys and men. So his argument is that this constant negativity towards masculinity can really impact boys' self-esteem
Yeah, I could see that.
and their academic performance. He believes that boys need to see positive role models. They need to hear stories of male achievement to feel valued and motivated to succeed. So he's calling for a more balanced approach to education, one that celebrates the strengths and contributions of both genders. And it's not just about the curriculum and the textbooks. Riker also criticizes the way boys are treated in the classroom.
Okay.
He suggests that boys are often punished more harshly than girls for the same behavior, and that their natural energy and exuberance is often seen as disruptive or problematic.
Right, like they're being told to stifle their natural instincts.
And he argues that this can lead to a sense of alienation, resentment among boys, making them feel like they don't belong in school. So he's calling for greater understanding and sensitivity towards the needs of boys, saying they need just as much support and encouragement as girls to thrive.
I think that's a valid point.
It is. He suggests that teachers need training to recognize and respond to the different learning styles of boys
Mm.
and the different behavioral patterns,
Mm.
and that schools need to create environments that are both challenging and supportive. So it's about creating a learning environment where all students feel valued and respected, regardless of their gender.
It's about inclusivity.
Right, and Riker goes on to discuss the long-term consequences of this education gap between boys and girls.
Okay.
He argues that it's not just an academic issue.
Right.
It's a societal issue with really far-reaching implications for men's economic prospects, their health, their overall well-being. He cites statistics on male unemployment, homelessness, incarceration rates, suggesting that these problems are, at least in part, a result of our education system failing to prepare boys for success.
So basically what happens in school doesn't stay in school.
Exactly. It can have a ripple effect throughout their lives.
Hmm.
Riker's argument is that we are failing our boys.
Hmm.
And in doing so, we're failing society as a whole. He's calling for a fundamental rethinking of how we approach education, one that recognizes the unique needs of boys and gives them the tools they need to succeed.
So what would that look like?
Well, he suggests that we need to move away from this one-size-fits-all model of education
Yeah.
and towards a more personalized approach, one that caters to the different learning styles and strengths of all students.
Right, recognizing that everyone learns differently.
Exactly. And he sees this future where boys and men are no longer demonized or marginalized, but celebrated for their unique contributions to society.
Mhm.
It's a powerful message, and I think it's one that's going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, especially those who feel like the system isn't working for them.
Right, exactly. But there's still more to uncover in Riker's analysis.
I bet.
Okay, so in this last part, Riker really gets into some, I guess you could say, controversial territory. He starts talking about sexual misconduct policies
Mm-hmm.
and how they've impacted men.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot button issue for sure.
It is, and he goes right to the heart of it, arguing that while these policies were put in place with good intentions, they've often created this climate of fear and uncertainty for men,
Yeah.
especially on college campuses and in the workplace.
So it's like a chilling effect almost.
Right, exactly.
Uh-huh.
And he suggests that the influence of feminist ideology on these policies has led to some unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, he talks about things like lowering the burden of proof in sexual misconduct cases and broadening the definition of what actually constitutes misconduct. And he's pretty critical of the disciplinary procedures, saying they often favor the accuser and don't provide proper due process for the accused. And he even shares some pretty compelling examples. Men who were expelled from universities or lost their jobs based on allegations that turned out to be false or unsubstantiated.
Wow. So he's saying that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction.
Yeah, that in our efforts to protect women from sexual assault, we've created a system that can be easily abused and unfairly punish innocent men.
It's a tough balance, right?
It is. It's a very delicate balance. But he raises these really important questions about fairness, due process, the presumption of innocence, and he calls for a reevaluation of these policies, suggesting that they need to be more balanced, protect the rights of both the accused and the accuser.
It makes sense.
And he emphasizes the importance of education and awareness. Men and women both need to be better informed about consent, boundaries, and the potential consequences of their actions. So it's about fostering a culture of respect and understanding, where everyone feels safe and their rights are protected.
Right, creating a safer environment for everyone.
Exactly. And finally, Riker brings us to what I think is the core of his argument.
What's that?
This need for men to reclaim their masculinity, to fight for equality. He believes that men have been demonized and marginalized for too long. Their voices silenced, their contributions to society undervalued. So he calls for a rejection of this whole toxic masculinity narrative.
Right.
And he says true masculinity isn't about aggression or dominance, but about strength, honor, responsibility. And he encourages men to embrace these natural instincts, as protectors, as providers, not just for their families, but for their communities, for the world. He sees a need for men to step up and be leaders, to use their strength and courage to make a positive impact.
So it's about taking responsibility, stepping into that role.
Right. And he calls for a return to these traditional values, things like hard work, self-reliance, personal responsibility.
Okay.
He argues that these are essential for men to thrive in the modern world. So his book is really a rallying cry for men who feel left behind. It's a call to action to reclaim their rightful place in society and fight for a future where men and women can live together in harmony.
That's a powerful message.
It is. And he encourages readers to connect with like-minded individuals, to join men's rights groups, to engage in constructive dialogue about these challenges that men face.
Right, to find support and community.
Exactly. He believes that by working together, men can create a better world for themselves, for their families, for future generations. It's a message of hope, a message of empowerment, a reminder that men have the power to shape their own destiny. So what does all of this mean for you? Well, Riker's book is definitely going to spark some strong reactions. You might agree with some things, disagree with others. You might even find yourself questioning some of your own long-held beliefs.
I can see that. It's challenging a lot of conventional wisdom.
It is. But one thing is for sure. It's a book that's going to make you think. It'll challenge your assumptions about gender and the complexities of these issues. And if you're interested in exploring Riker's ideas further, you can find Soccer Moms Gone Wild on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Definitely a thought-provoking read. It'll give you a lot to consider.
Absolutely. And as always, we encourage you to form your own opinions. The conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep striving for a world where all genders can thrive.
Well said.
Until next time, keep diving deep.